Good evening. I'm calling this work session, April 25th to order. Is it budget review?
Yep, a whole hour.
Whole hour just for you, Michelle.
You don't have to use the whole hour. Just give it
All right, hello, good evening. That's right.
Speaking of that,
We gotta build
Yeah.
it, you have to read it. I think before we start this evening looking at a couple of new items since we last met, I want to take a small amount of time and just revisit some of the topics that we discussed in our last meeting. Because there was discussion, I want to do some follow-up, and I also want to give an opportunity for feedback. So last week during the work session, we provided ARPA update and some ARPA charts. And since that time, I just wanted to make everybody aware, one of the follow-up things we had on our next steps for ARPA was to have a meeting with Brooks House, which has been confirmed, so got that scheduled for next week. Also, there was a presentation that the body heard on envy, and I want to take a moment just to step back to say, envy is an initiative and a coalition of multiple partners, but envy itself is not an organization. So in order to give grant funding or to write grants that would go to envy, they first have to be an organization. So it's an initiative, it's a great initiative. They've built a strategic plan, but I think there's some additional steps. What we can do is all of the partners that are involved in that initiative, we can all continue to collaborate and we can make efforts and we can do things within our organizations that help meet those goals. And so one of the things that the city was looking to do was expand on a current position that we have here, so that one of our staff could help coordinate and facilitate, kind of like be the point of contact for that whole group. So hopefully that helps, because I know there was some discussion about envy, and there was specific discussion regarding being able to give ARPA funding to envy, and I just want to make sure we really can't give it to envy because it doesn't exist as an organization, but there's things we can do with ARPA funding geared toward youth violence to help with that initiative. Last, on our ARPA charts last week, we had a placeholder for about a little over $700,000 in revenue replacement. And I did mention that I had previously spoke with both Jim Bender and Eric Dykey. There is a need for traffic control signal upgrades. And so for two, we're looking at about $1 million. So that would take that remaining placeholder, as well as if we did two out of ARPA, we would have to look to reallocate from other funds. We were in the midst of an inspection and a study to look across the city. We would have to then, once we got that study back, decide which areas, because that is going to be a every year, long time project, like where we're going to do replacements. And so just to give you a little bit of background, we'd have to do design. After we awarded the design to somebody, the design could take up to 3 months for each signal area. And then once we got the design back, probably another 2 to 3 months to do a formal bid and to actually award it and get back to council. And then once it was awarded, we're looking at 6 months or longer, because there's currently longer lead times on some of the supplies. So again, something that we could definitely have done before December 30th of 2024. But if we were moving in that direction, we would be looking at coming back to talk to council soon about areas across town if we were interested in doing any with ARPA, and if so, moving that forward over the next couple months.
so I get the impression from that presentation that I feel like I'm possibly being asked to choose between the two.
between the two.
Of the presentation we received of the initiatives of Envy and the signalization upgrades. I just want to make sure that's not the case.
No, that's not the case.
Okay, so that being said, when you're saying that there are opportunities to utilize remaining ARPA funds for the initiatives that Envy has begun and elaborated on, are you saying that there are ARPA funds elsewhere within that total amount to exhaust on that purpose as well as the signalization?
Sure. So we specifically had 25,000 in our strategic plan on how we were going to spend ARPA. 25,000 for youth violence prevention program, and we haven't really had anything else that really fit that. So some Envy initiatives would certainly fit within that category if timing-wise, they were ready to go and move forward.
Okay, then, thinking back to that presentation last week, one of the comments I heard from the chief was that he was going to absorb that within the police department budget. And my comment was, if we have ARPA funds, and that is the intent and spirit and purpose of ARPA funds, why aren't we directing ARPA funds to that? I realize we can't do it to some, undefined entity as Envy, but we can certainly do it within our public safety department, as part of that.
Well, the ask last week was for the additional responsibility that the staff would be taking on and potentially the reclassification of that position that may have had an increase in pay. That was the ask, and that's what I would absorb in my budget if that's what we were gonna do. I think we worked out something between finance, we worked on that today or yesterday, so we got something figured out on that. The ask for the Envy initiative for funding wouldn't come to me. It wouldn't come to the police department because the initiatives would be community-driven. So there may be an opportunity through those community-driven initiatives that ARPA money could be used for, that would help fund the organizations that are within the partnership for their initiatives that would carry forward. We would be the catalyst to bring that back here and present and say that this is part of the Envy initiative, that we feel this would be good opportunity for this money to be spent to go towards that violence prevention, but it wouldn't come to the police department.
But you're-
Okay, go ahead.
I was gonna say you're paying out of your budget for the person who would get the data too, right?
She's already on the payroll now anyway, so, that's already, it would be an added extra responsibility that she's more than willing to take on. So it wouldn't be anything that would be ARPA funded, that would be a need from ARPA funding.
So it could be up to several hours a week, and that is something that we could look at. And we could, because that was within the city's budget, we have the flexibility that in July, when we come back and we have a better idea where some of these other projects are, if we are looking to reallocate, that's definitely something to keep in mind. And
And I
yes, but we have to segregate those.
I guess that's my question is, when you come back in July, I want to know if 25,000 is enough to address this need. And if it's not, I want to know what that number is, and if it's 100,000, I'm good with that number. I just want
And
to.
that's gonna be the meetings that are gonna start taking
Okay.
place starting tomorrow. That starts with our executive group, and it's gonna span out over our partners to figure out where that need to push the initiatives in, either geographic areas or to focus on those youth that we wanna focus on, how that money can be spent to further that cause through those organizations. But we'll be able to come back.
The 25,000 was basically a placeholder.
It just seems small to me.
That's why it was a placeholder.
Okay.
Because we knew they were developing a strategic plan that would involve initiatives moving forward with a collaborative group. We just didn't know what they were. So now that there's a strategic plan out there, they can now get together, the group can get together and say, we want to do this, this, or this, and then attach a cost to it that we can bring back. And maybe 25,000 isn't enough. If it isn't, we'll find what we need out of that ARPA pot of even with the allocated, because there are some things that have allocations that aren't gonna use all of it.
Right.
So once those are identified, and those should be identified, they have to be identified by July, then we'll come back and say, hey, instead of 25, we want to give 100.
Okay.
For this, and this specific things that we would then, make sure would go to one of the partners that could then initiate the program.
Yeah, I just don't want your action plan to falter because the unavailability
No.
of funding,
Yep.
whatever that
Nope,
was.
not gonna
And
happen.
I appreciate that, I know the partners appreciate that. Now is where the real work's gonna start working. It took us a while to get to the strategic plan part. So now when we have these meetings and we start driving that action plan, then we'll know where those initiatives are gonna fall in terms of cost for whatever partners are gonna be doing, whatever they're gonna be doing, that then the ask could come back for that, for those partners, those organizations and
I-
agencies that would,
And if-
that can receive it.
And if the group collaboratively isn't quite to that point by this year or next year, I think between the city of Hagerstown and those other partners that are participating in that initiative, we all have the ability to apply for other grants. So that would be the goal. It wouldn't just be the city of Hagerstown, it wouldn't just be, Washington County Public Schools, it
Right.
wouldn't just be DGS. Like, all of the groups would be able to write grants for things that fall within their
Yeah,
organizations.
that grant writing is really, Envy initiative and that strategic plan bolsters the ability to write a grant for money, because you have a plan and a strategic plan and a partnership that you've built. So if one of the partners that would write a grant for something, Board of Ed, and they would show that partnership with Envy and this initiative and where we want to go with it, it adds credence for them to be able to get the money they would need to push their initiatives forward. And then on the government side, where they can't file for something like that, and maybe we want to do something as a city government, we could write, part of that grant would be written maybe to help them, as long as it falls in line with what we want to do with the money we want to spend within the city, whether it's overtime or getting things or whatever that is. So it's how we write grants now. Nothing's really changed. This plan gives a lot more value to that grant writing process for whoever wants to write, if they're part of our partnership. It gives them a lot more value to write the grant and maybe get what they're trying to get.
Yeah, I think for me, it did not go unnoticed, and both of you mentioned it here again this evening. It certainly did not go unnoticed, the importance that the Board of Ed or representative thereof is at the table now, where that has not occurred in the past.
Yep.
That has been a very secular relationship when it comes to school matters being community matters in the past, and I think it is very important for folks to understand. And I know I made the comment there are no city schools last week, but here's the reality. About 20 of our 40 county schools have student population of youth that live within the city, and so that's just a huge number, and I just think I don't want anything to stymie that relationship that your group has created to bring the school system into that conversation.
I can tell you that from the partners that reached out to me after last week, they're excited about what they heard from this body and the support they're hearing from that. So that's invaluable. And I appreciate it. I know they do too.
I'm sorry.
No.
I just wanted to make sure that nobody thought that the city of Hagerstown could write a check to Envy.
Right.
Or that we could write a grant, get grant monies, and give grant monies directly to Envy, because you have to be an organization first.
Yeah, if we're gonna write a grant, it would be the police department writing the grant, or another department within the city be writing the grant.
Or the school board,
Or
or
the
some,
school board,
yeah.
on behalf of
or the
that,
partner.
on behalf of the Envy initiative, not as Envy. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So,
So I don't remember if this was part of Envy or if this was part of something else. But I remember we talked about like a street person, a mentor or something like that. Is that
violence interrupter.
something- Say that
A
again?
violence interrupter.
A violence interrupter,
Yes.
right. So is that something that could be a part of Envy?
Yes.
And a part
Yes.
of, okay.
And we've watched that, we've seen that at other jurisdictions that's gone through, health departments have ran those programs as part of that. Those are opportunities now that we have the strategic plan that we wouldn't have probably had the opportunity before, because we don't have a finalized written plan of partnerships, we all worked well together here for as many years as I can remember, but to formalize it down to this really gives a lot more robust opportunity to get that money and be able to do those things that we probably couldn't have done in the past.
Thank you.
To that point, I do want to make sure, like Kristen said, I'd rather see this money go for the spirit of ARPA than, you know, things like, you know, traffic signals. I mean, I know they're needed, but, you know, if we can make sure, even if we just update on allocated funds that aren't going to be used to make sure we, you know, have money to put towards this rather than, you know, kind of just.
So, under the category, kind of where ENVI initiatives would occur, under public health and negative economic impact, just as a reminder, we have behavioral and mental health for $500,000. And that was, originally, we were thinking crisis center, and we know that that's not happening. And then we also had a block, $25,000 for youth violence. So neither one of those have started. We also still had $425,000 that was going to be for the educational, transportation, childcare, like that whole block. And, you know, some of the initiatives and things that were within the ENVI plan could be impacted there underneath that education block. So we have other blocks of money that haven't been designated for any individual group and hasn't been started yet. So there is money. I don't want you to think that there's not.
Good, good.
Very good.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Ms. Nago?
yeah, I agree with everything everyone said. I mean, just based on just recent HPD posts on social media, and there's some kids that we're familiar with, that this program would definitely have helped to avoid that situation. But yeah, the money we have set aside is not enough, so we definitely need to revisit that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So, ARPA, was there any other questions though, follow-up feedback from last week or anything else on ARPA right now? We also covered, and we did it extremely fast, so I apologize, but we covered Economic Redevelopment Fund and Community Development Block Grant, which is our CDBG, our federally funded fund in our programs. Any follow-up or questions or concerns from anybody about those items? Okay, so what I think we'll do is we'll go ahead and we will take a minute to talk about user fees and rates. So in our budget book, there is an entire section. It is section 8, and it has nothing but a listing of different user fees, service charges across a variety of departments. For anything that was changing, water, wastewater, there's already a 5-year cost rate study that has been approved. So again, nothing new was needed for fiscal year '24 to change those rates because it was the final year of it. Same for stormwater. Eric Dykey had come a month or so ago and discussed some changes to rates throughout all of the parks and several of our amenities there. So really, there was only 2 other things that I think are within that section that we're looking to either change. One was a change, and that is, right now, we have fees that we do with State Highway Administration. And we're working on updating the rates that we're charging there because it hasn't been updated in a while. We're not sure that we'll be fully where we need to be to have that done and the agreement in place with them by July, but we're looking to change it from $1,500 to $2,000. And then separately, I have both Kathy and Paul back here. Within the Code Administration Department, we're looking to add a new vacant structure reinspection fee for $150. So again, wanted to just take a minute to stop to discuss 2 other fees that are changing, potentially changing, that weren't in place for fiscal year '23 that haven't already previously been approved or discussed.
What's the vacant? Can you explain on that, the vacant
You
restructure?
want to look to Paul or Kathy?
They hate each other. You're it.
So unfortunately, with some of our vacant properties in town, they've been using our office as their compliance agency or their property managers to make sure that they do work that their contractors have been hired to do. So they're calling us for these, and then if the work's not done, then the company's saying, well, can you call the contractor and tell them what needs to be done? So they're using us as like their property manager. So we're just keep on running out to these properties, and there are properties causing some blight in our community. So we want to make sure that we're receiving the proper fees for our services.
Okay.
Sounds
Makes sense.
fair.
And the reason we're bringing it to special attention is because there are several things, when you look on that schedule, there are things and it tells you if something needs to be changed by resolution or ordinance, so all of those would separately come and be independently voted on. But then there's other things that are done by administrative order. So basically, if you pass and adopt the budget, then whatever is there is that administrative order. So we just wanted to take a minute and make sure everybody was aware of the things that were changing from fiscal year '23. Okay. Next up,
Okay, so now we're gonna move on to the capital improvement program in section 7 on page 1. Capital improvement projects are larger projects like land, buildings, infrastructure, things of that nature. And each capital improvement project back in the back has a 5-year budget projection. On page 1, right in the center is a chart that lists the budget for each fund. Tonight, we're gonna be looking at mostly general fund and parking. So for example, the general fund has about 40.1 million budgeted in FY '24. And then just a little ways down, you'll see 10.3 million budgeted in the parking fund for FY '24. Citywide, 74.1 million is budgeted, and that is up 30.5 million over FY '23 revised budget.
and the large increase can really be attributed to two main projects, the Hagerstown Fieldhouse and the parking deck, when you're looking at budget year to budget year.
On page 2 and 3, is where we try to group each CIP into each category of the strategic plan. So for example, about 2 down, you'll see public safety. There's 6.1 million of CIP projects. An example will be on the next page, Parks and Recreation. There's 1.7 million in CIP funding for that initiative. And this is citywide, so this will be the 74.1 million. As just a reminder, inside the front cover is a short version of that strategic plan, and in the overview on page 53 is more detail.
So this is one of the few places, we've been able to do it and incorporate it into our budget document, and then we have been able to incorporate it within our PAFR, our Popular Annual Financial Report. But where we take the big categories that make up and encompass the Mayor and Council strategic plan, neighborhood revitalization and sustainability, public safety, everything you see there that it's in italics and underlined, those were the primary components. And then this is really one of the only places where we can come back and quantify all of our individual projects into here. So when you say, hey, we got citywide 74.1 million, we have looked at those individual capital projects and tried to put a price tag within each. Now, there is lots within public safety that is not capital, that's on the operating side. We don't go back and try to encompass every single thing because it would be extremely difficult to do that. But again, big picture, we try to make sure that it's visible to people that you don't just create the plan and not do it. You've identified key things, and we're working towards all those initiatives and how much is in each component in the bucket.
Okay, so then we'll move on to page 16. This is a listing by all general fund capital improvement projects by funding source. So, for example, if a capital improvement project had multiple funding sources, you'll see that project in each of those buckets. But just as an example, ARPA, for example, the first one, 3.5 million, which equals out to about 8.5% of total CIPs in the general fund. Next down is bond financing, which is 19.3 million. This is a big one at 47.4%. Again, mostly by, well, actually all by the Hagerstown Fieldhouse. On page 20, transfers to CIP from the general fund is 2.1 million, which equals 5.2% of total CIPs from the general fund.
So actually, this is one of my favorite reports throughout the budget book and document that I refer to a lot throughout the year. Some people don't like it as well because if you're looking for a project, again, as Brooke said, you're gonna see it in all the different components. So you're not gonna look necessarily here and see, oh, under ARPA, if there's a project listed, this is how much it is. But this gives you a feel for how we're spending all of our designated and restricted funds. And on this report, in the second column, it gives you a project number. That project number has a detailed sheet for that project behind in the section that follows. So it's a great reference. But again, for me, I'm oftentimes focused on all the variety of the funding sources, and it, as Brooke mentioned and highlighted, she highlighted several of the big ones. All of the funds have a similar report. It's just that some of the other funds, like electric, doesn't have multiple funding sources. Most, all of electric is done through their service charges or the electric fund.
On page 24, you can actually see the same report, but instead it's sorted by department. Here you'll actually probably see mostly a full entire project rather than broken down by funding source. And then on page 26, this actually report almost combines the two. It's by department and then by funding source, so lots of different ways to look.
And again, so we talked about 40 million is in the general fund in the CIPs. So I'm gonna take a minute and we're gonna go look on page 51, which is the Hagerstown Fieldhouse. Just to kind of put it into perspective and just take a minute to talk summary high level, because in the next week or two, we'll be coming back with our partner, Eastern Sports Management, ESM, and John Wack, to talk about very specific deadlines, dates, funding, like where we, an overall status update and next steps. But on page 51, you can see the Hagerstown Fieldhouse project itself, currently at 24 million. We had a little bit of money that we were projecting to spend within fiscal year 25. This 24 is just what would we anticipate spending in budget fiscal year 24, and if the field house would be started and completed by then. It has a variety of funding sources and a variety of grants and different types of monies that we actually staff in Rodney Tissue in conjunction sometimes with ESM and with our partners and our lobbyists down in Annapolis to attempt to get funding so that we can move this forward. But again, 24 million out of 40. So you can see the largest part of the general fund is there. So when I don't take time to stop on others, it's not because the project isn't important or isn't big and doesn't have a variety of things. It's just that this by far is one of the largest money-wise and also timing-wise, right? And the amount of resources that it's gonna take.
So, given that reality and watching this number grow over time, I had a couple of questions, I think very similar to the questions we asked about the parking deck, as it is now sort of getting underway, is, for me, like, there has to be a ceiling to that number. And we have to, I think, determine at what point, we reach in the process to feel secure in managing that ceiling. So, I do have concern because when we started this discussion some years back, this is a $10.5 million project, right? And then it was 17, and it was like, okay, but we really need these things. And we worked with the partner to determine, through that, we met with different entities and organizations that said, we'll use it if there are these components. And so, it went from 17 and 20, and I'm sitting here looking at a figure of 24, and that causes me concern, because when I got the email last week, in here you have a number of 2.5 million from the state.
Yes.
And the public, personification of the funding, if you will, in the last 6 months has been suggestive of this implication that the 2 million is like some new funding we got in this budget year, but it doesn't, but that's not the case,
Right.
right?
So,
It's just a reconfirmation of the 2 million that we secured
Last year,
last year,
correct.
which is not
New money.
right, and
It's a little misleading.
it is.
so when
And I don't want the public to be, you know, misled on that fact. You know, just as much as I don't want to, not recognize the return on investment that has clearly been provided through the process, right? So I'm trying to balance the two. And so, you know, there's clearly a return on investment, there's clearly public interest in the project, but for me, like, this has to have an affordable metric to it. And I think we need to be honest with the public that, you know, a significant portion of this is borrowing, and an unknown amount of that, lesser today than what I thought it was a week ago, you know, is through that state partnership. I'm not saying I'm not appreciative of that, but I want to make sure, as Matt indicated, that we're honest with the public to say, the number isn't 5 at this point, it's really 2.5. And, you know, that's where we're at, and we're going to keep going back to the state, no differently really than schools do when they go and, you know, look for additional funding for school construction. And so, I needed to get that out there because I know people often sort of pigeonhole and say, this is your project, and it's not my project. But, you know, so I feel even more compelled to make sure that there is that transparency that I have with the citizens.
So what we did at the time that we created the budget document, you'll look on the project at the top, we have fiscal year, under description, we have fiscal year '24, and we've listed various grant funding sources. And at the point of building the budget, I assumed that even if we applied for money, if it was only in the application process, I did not build the budget that we were receiving all of it. I did it in the reverse. I said, okay, if we get nothing more, at the time I built the budget, the city would need to finance 19.3. And then we listed where we had requested additional money. So we had a request out for community project funding through Congressman Trone's office. We had a request in through Senator George Edwards' fund. And we had, up to that point, been hearing more positive direction that we were going to receive additional monies from the state. And we've been very fortunate. So with the information that I just saw today, or earlier this week, we are getting another $1 million. So instead of 2.5,
Right.
we're going to get a total of 3.5.
Right.
Again, the 3 million that's there that we're seeing isn't 3 million in addition to, no.
Right.
It's another $1 million, because the 2.5, when we received notice of that funding in the prior year, they were splitting it out over 2 grant periods. So it's still over 2 grant periods, but now instead of 2.5 million, it'll be 3.5 million. Which is good, but as you have noted, and that's going to be some of the conversation, and was some of the focus when we looked at the general fund financial projections, if the city has got to finance 19.3 million, we're looking at probably a $1.5 million annual debt
Debt
service,
service.
right? So if that becomes a reality, then the question, once you look at these other projects, they're gonna disappear for the next couple years, because to make up that difference of the $1.5 million debt service, unless there is some new revenue streams, or unless timing pushes this back, unless there's other funding sources that happen, private donations that come forward, unless we're able to get and secure other monies, then that is going to be the very hard question.
Yeah, I feel like some of those things haven't come to fruition from those other, you know, I don't want to say partners, but, you know, opportunities.
Right.
so far. Maybe they will as we get further down that road. But for me, like, I think we need to make sure that we are cognizant of, you know, where that
Sure.
number is, and I think we do need to make sure that there's a ceiling, to that.
Yes.
No
So-
differently than we did for the deck.
So as a reminder, we put everything out to bid when we started this process. We selected Eastern Sports Management Company. They came forth, they did the initial phase, very abbreviated feasibility study for 70,000. They came back at the end of that and said, okay, this is where we're at, this is what we've heard, this is what it looks like. Do you want us to go for it with the next phase? Which we did. That phase included things like getting with all the community and getting with others and getting the interest, developing a really good feasibility and marketing plan, developing a financial and funding plan, developing a document that could be shared with all these areas to help secure funding, right? Because it was more concrete. We also have completed, and that was part of phase 2, the developer agreement, excuse me. So that was just done and executed and voted on by this body back in February. And then once that was done, we said, okay, now here's where we're at. Here's what we're looking at. And again, even in December and January, things were looking very different than where I think we are today in other potential funding sources that we were going to receive. So, you know, came back and Ronnie sat here and we said, okay, if we move forward with phase 3, this will be the actual architectural design. Like this, instead of just seeing it in concept, here's what we're going to do, and it's $500,000. And we said, yes, we're ready to make this move and continue toward this project. Now, again, that's all the further that we've voted on, and that's all the further that we have done to this point. So we've engaged, they started that. And honestly, they would be ready to start working on bid documents and things. So we'll have more details available within the next 2 weeks.
Yeah. I mean, just think, you know, we need to remain cognizant. We do not have the unfettered additional capacity of the MSA to attach
Correct.
millions, so.
Correct. But if there's any other projects or anything that you want to look at, these remain online and stay here. And again, it provides a lot of detail. One of the other reasons I like to stop and I wanted to focus on this one isn't so much to say, whoo, look at the big numbers, but on this, you will also see there's a description, there's a beautiful picture in color, there's justification, but there's also this little, like in the middle to the bottom of the page, this little chart or place where you can put budget impact. And typically, if we are going to issue a bond, we like to go ahead and put right on this page how much we are looking to borrow, what we're anticipating, like the term and the interest rates, so that everybody can see it, so that it's just being more open and clear. And then oftentimes we will also come back, if we've borrowed the money but haven't yet completed the project, we will also continue to leave it there for the following year. But again, it won't be present on all projects, just projects that we're doing that on.
Okay, so next we'll move on to professional court extension on page 94. This is the city's portion of the county project that connects Eastern Boulevard to the Robinwood Drive area. On April 19th, we received notification from the county that they're getting ready to start our portion, and the anticipated completion date is December 24th, 2023. This is a $3.3 million estimated total project. 1.1 million is projected for FY '23, 2.3 in FY '24. Down in the funding source area, you'll see that $1,150,000 ARPA funding, some CIP fund balance, and then there's $1,250,000 in ARC grants. $350,000 is budgeted for FY '23 and $900,000 in FY '24.
So this is a perfect example. So Some of this project we're anticipating being done and being spent in the current fiscal year '23, so you're not gonna necessarily see that reflected. But we're gonna go ahead and give the fiscal year '24 information. We like to include sometimes up in the description, especially in the bigger ones, and when we talk about the parking deck, you'll see it, where we're including monies that we think we're spending during that time period. But this project itself doesn't just have federal ARPA dollars, it also has federal ARC grants, and I think it's 2 different grants. So for that, the ARC money, there's also a requirement that there has to be local funds that match it. So it's not like if we said, okay, well, Michelle, you already have ARPA dollars here, if this project's moving forward, reallocate to here. I really cannot, because there's other types of federal funding here, and I can't match federal dollars with federal dollars, if that makes sense. Thank you, Brooke.
Okay.
And again, just as an update from last week on ARPA, the county did indicate things were getting ready to go. I think a press release was going out, and we'll start to see probably major traffic disruptions for the Eastern Boulevard. All in the name of progress, so.
Sean, I see here that it says, if the bridge becomes part of city infrastructure, is there a question as to whether or not
The last line.
it says it will incur, an additional $100,000 a year if the bridge becomes city infrastructure?
Under the budget impact.
Right, but is there some question as to whether or not it will become city infrastructure?
I have to go back and look. We might have to remove the if. So at one point in time, currently, the bridge is not the city's asset, and the city did not pay for the construction of that bridge. But I think when we had an interim city administrator and an effort of collaboration to get this project moving, the city did agree, after so many years, once it was built and the widening happened, that we would take on the maintenance efforts of that bridge. It would become ours.
Okay.
So that would have happened 2 administrations ago?
Believe,
No,
no,
the
one,
last one.
yeah.
But I'm pretty sure,
2019.
and Jim's here, I'm not gonna put him on the spot, but off the top of my head, I cannot remember the date.
You wanna be on the spot,
If Jim does, he can come up, but if not, we can actually do a follow-up and send you all an email on that.
Thank you, I was just curious.
So I'm going off of memory from what.
I know, that's why I'm not
Ronnie
giving a
talked
date.
about. There is an agreement that the city will end up taking over the bridge at some point. It'll become ours. But also in that agreement, I believe it says that for major improvements to the bridge in the future, if it needs a major rehabilitation or major work, there is going to be sharing with the county in that, and the federal funds that the county allocates toward bridge maintenance, major bridge work, they would allocate money specifically for the rehabilitation of that bridge.
Right. I think it was that case because the county basically said, listen, if we have to build it to city standard, which includes those pedestrian-oriented
Right.
accessibilities, that we otherwise would not be doing that.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay, so then we'll move on to the parking fund on page 163. This, of course, the largest one is the third parking deck on Antietam Street, called the Hub City Garage now. On April 3rd, the land was purchased for $1.2 million. And I think Jim is currently working on the contract for this, and construction is anticipated to start in May.
So the contractor has been notified, we've awarded it, but they're just finalizing the final paperwork and the agreement, and they're anticipating still starting shoveling dirt, because Jim and Eric have been both very good and diligent on checking in by mid-May.
It's estimated to be about $12.5 million in total, some of that taking place in FY '23. The main change here, since The budget completion is the change from 10 to 10.6 million in bond proceeds.
Which we've already separately came back and, have done, approvals. And just as a follow-up for that, for our bond anticipation note, our, financial advisor was able to get that RFP out a week or so ago. We've only really had one follow-up question, so hopefully we'll be getting some interest, and we'll be able to return soon to tell you what that looks like and what the funding is going to be. All right, so now with parking, there's really, I think there was one other small CIP, but in talking about the parking deck, I just want to take a minute and go to the financial projections section. Whew, I said that 2 times fast. And take a look at parking fund projections, because the parking deck, again, as we've been talking about, and as you've heard me mention, and was one of the reasons why we stopped to consider, 4 level versus do we remove a level? What do we need to do to be affordable? So the parking fund projections are on section 6, page 25. Much like when we looked at the general fund in this section, you're going to see 2 years of history. So you have fiscal year 21 and 22. Then in the middle, you're going to see the current year, fiscal year 23. You're going to see the revised budget as where at that time we estimated we would be by June 30. And then fiscal year 24 budget. And then from fiscal year 24 budget, we're making projections on what the next 4 years would look like. So fiscal year 25 through 28. Unlike the general fund, the parking fund is an enterprise fund, meaning what they're charging for their services and what people and the customers are paying to park is supposed to support and cover all of its expenses. So in the parking fund, if you look, it's at the very, very bottom of the page, you're going to see where it says increase, decrease, and retained earnings. That's looking at, in any given year, the amount of revenue and charges and dollars we're getting from customers, minus what we're paying out in our expenses and our bills and some depreciation, how much is left. And if it is in brackets, that means we're losing money. We're going to flip the page. And then what we do, because this is an enterprise fund, and a lot of times, everybody's not so much focused on an individual year and if you make money or you lose money. It looks at, okay, how much and what does that impact to your cash, right? Your cash balance and your fund balance. So again, the second page is literally doing that, taking away all those things and adding back anything that has cash implications. So again, if you look in fiscal year 24, you see at the very end it says net surplus / deficit. If it is in parentheses, it means cash is going to decrease. So in fiscal year 24 budget, at the time we did that, we were anticipating paying and starting on the project, but not having the money yet. So that's why the cash is really upside down. And then you see it straighten and come back a little bit better in the out years. But the bottom number underneath that is total cash that fund has in the bank. But and you can see and we've talked about it, and we've talked about this for years, as we build that parking deck from the infrastructure, no matter if we are bond financing it or how we're paying for it, it is going to have a direct and immediate impact on cash. And cash is going to be upside down in the fund for a number of years. So let's flip back for just a second. In fiscal year 24, and we're going to the revenue section, we have a subtotal for parking deck revenue, subtotal for the lots and the meters. Then we have other revenue, and in the middle of the page, you'll see total operating. So basically, for fiscal year 24 budget, it's based on trends, it's based on how we're doing. It's not as easy as what it was prior to COVID, but at least for fiscal year 24, we've at least got past that a little bit, that things are more normal. You can almost annualize. You can almost see where your trends are heading. So under the parking deck revenue, you'll see the parking deck 3. We will update that since we have the name for it. But in fiscal year 25, you'll see a total of $358,000. Now, that isn't by looking at history and trends. The deck itself, we were anticipating was going to be 395 spaces. we know that several of those spaces are already gonna be occupied because there's current residents. So to calculate this, I based it on 365 because we had about 30 we thought were gonna be designated for other areas. Then, instead of 52 weeks a year, I use 50 weeks a year because we have holidays and times where we have free parking. Next, overall, so while I might not have things really good within that specific line item, we're adding a third parking deck. So as we add a third one, what's gonna happen? Some people who are parking in University District or in A&E may simply no longer park in those and will park in Hub City, and vice versa. So in the assumptions, I'm anticipating 40% brand-new parkers, brand new into the parking system itself, and that's driven by development. Then I looked at, right now, there should be 60 home games. Again, not at all events that are gonna happen, because I don't have that type of a calendar, but there are to be 60 home games, and then if everybody's paying and all 365 spaces are utilized, adding those two things together, hopefully that would give us an additional $358,000 in the parking fund. Now, once we get further along on the construction, we will definitely have to come back and talk rates, okay? Because rates will impact this. And again, I don't have a crystal ball, but if anybody parks in the University District deck, or even, you know, Eric provides it as part of his weekly updates, you can see what the current occupancy rate is in that deck. Same for A&E. So 40% new customer base outside of the games is pretty good, because University District, on average, isn't even 50% filled. Normal through the day with nothing additional. He's looking at me like.
I just did the math, so basically, like, each new parking deck space in the new deck has to be $250 a day, right?
I'm hoping for more,
Oh, yeah, I think you've erred on a conservative side.
hopefully. I'm hoping for better, right? I'm hoping that it is better.
Well, and I think that you've erred a bit conservatively as well, because if you see the actual for 23 coming in, it looks like it's more, you know what I mean, than what you're projecting for
Right.
next year, so
Yes,
hopefully that trend,
continue,
yeah, keeps
continues
going.
and only increases.
Goes back up to the, you know,
And again, so that's the first
The
year.
million year
So
number.
fiscal year 25 would be the first full year for the parking deck. We know that and we're anticipating that there's going to be other growth and revitalization. While the stadium is committed to being done and open, all the other development that's going to happen around there might not be done and ready to impact our fiscal year 25 numbers. So that was the other reason.
so if the spring, if the deck's open in spring as projected, we could still capture 2 to 3 months of unaccounted for revenue in
Yes.
this. So the 358.
No pressure on Jim and Eric in the
We
contract.
might see 40 of it, you know, of that 358 this
Yes.
coming fiscal year.
Yes.
And that's not counting any other things that happen there.
So, well, again, 60 home games, and I'm assuming that all 365 spaces, again, excluding the 30 for other residents, would be filled, right? But yeah, there should be some trickle effect. If they
If there's
pack
a
the seats for those
concert, if
home
there's
games, we
something
should
that
get
happens.
more than that, because we should get people coming into both of the other parking decks. So hopefully, yes. If you look a little further down the page, right below the middle, you see operating expenses. We kind of subtotal it there so that you can see it by areas. In the middle of that, you see the third parking deck. And basically what I've done is I've looked at the other two, University District and A&E. Because the operating expenses there doesn't so much differ because of how many parking spaces they have. We're gonna be paying for the same things. We're gonna be paying for software to utilize the gates and things. So looking at those two and average them. Not big changes. It's not like we have 5 staff people for the university assigned to the university deck and only 2 assigned to A&E. It's not how it works, so. That's the big differences in the parking fund projections. Again, didn't make any changes in assumptions for rates, but we're definitely gonna have that conversation, right? I mean, the reality is, we charge very minimal for an event. If you go anywhere else to park and you're parking right outside of a stadium, you're not paying minimum. And I'm not saying we're gonna charge $30 to park, but it's gonna be more than what the city is currently doing, the $5 fee for events, okay? Does anybody have any specific questions on layout or what's where, how we came to those numbers? So I think, looking forward to the meetings that are left, really truly, we only have stormwater, electric, water, wastewater. I think we can do that in one meeting. We could potentially do it in two. So we're gonna skip a budget review next week, come back May the 9th, and if we need, also May the 16th. But as a reminder, May the 9th is when our public hearing will be, okay?
Thank you.
May the 9th,
We're good?
public hearing. What time is the public hearing, May 9th?
7 o'clock.
Okay, I will not be here.
Okay. And we're adjourned for a 30-second, no? 3 minutes, and then we'll come back for our regular session.